From World War II Japan to the Crusades back in the 1200s, these are the worst places to be a prisoner of war in history. Number 5. Nazi Germany. The first place on our list is none other than Nazi Germany. This probably doesn't come as a surprise to you, considering that this group was responsible for the deaths of well over 6 million Jewish people and millions more lives throughout the events of World War II. The way that they handled their prisoners of war was equally barbaric. The Nazi ideology was one of extermination, with the rules essentially stating that if you didn't agree with the state, there was no option but to exterminate you. As a result, most prisoners of war were placed in the same concentration camps that were used to kill captured Jews, gypsies, and other targeted groups. The ultimate result was almost always death, either by fatal gas or shooting. However, before the Nazis exterminated their prisoners of war, they were often tortured for information and put through countless hours of physical labor so that they were in some way useful to the state. Living conditions were equally inhumane, with most prisoners barely receiving enough food to live or clothes to keep them warm. Toby Bieber, a survivor of a concentration camp, actually opened up on her experience in a recent interview, and here's how she described the conditions. And how we survived on this black water in the morning that was supposed to be coffee, or the gray soup at lunchtime with a little square of black bread that was like lime, and when we ate it, we didn't feel any different. It didn't satisfy in any way, and we were forever hungry. If you're tired, you're scared, you're hungry, lack of sleep, and always in fear from one minute to the next, we didn't know what's going to happen to us. Number 4. World War II Japan. As we've just seen, World War II was a pretty brutal period to live through. However, life was arguably even worse for prisoners of war captured by Japanese forces, who were literally put through hell and back. Conditions for these prisoners were worse than you could imagine. There was barely any food or fresh water, with prisoners receiving just a few handfuls of rice a day and some water soup. The guards would routinely beat up on the prisoners just for the fun of it, and on top of this, all able bodies were forced to work in factories for hours upon end. Disease was also a massive issue in these prison camps because so many people were cramped up in one room at a time. In fact, Charles Cleel, who was a prisoner of war in Japan, reported how at one time he was forced to sleep next to 2 dead bodies because disease was so rife. It has been reported that around 27,000 Americans were captured by the Japanese during World War II. However, of that number, 40% died in captivity due to the extreme conditions that they faced. Compare that to the 1% of American prisoners of war who died in German captivity, and you can understand just how brutal Japanese captivity was. The treatment of prisoners of war in Japan was so bad that it's since been labeled as a breach of the Geneva Convention, and as a result, the Japanese government started a POW Friendship and Remembrance program back in 2009. Number 3. The Crusades. Next, at number 3, we've got the Christian Crusader prison camps. Now, if you know anything about the Crusades, you know that the Western armies were, in a word, brutal. These guys would stop at no means to reach the Holy Land, happily murdering entire cities to achieve their goals. But what they did to their prisoners of war was even worse. Crusading armies would often capture able-bodied soldiers after conquering cities. Those who refused to convert would be subject to torture, slavery, labor, and even rape before they were ultimately put to death. Yeah, pretty ironic considering they were supposedly fighting a holy war. The most brutal example of how the Crusaders treated their prisoners of war occurred during the Third Crusade. In 1191, the Christian army conquered the area of Acre, amassing over 2,000 Muslim prisoners. And what did the army's leader, King Richard I, do with them? Well, he lined them up in front of his enemy Saladin and beheaded every single one of them. That's right, without warning, over 2,000 defenseless prisoners were slaughtered. It's safe to say that this didn't go down well, and Saladin eventually got his revenge by devastatingly crushing the Christian army. Number 2. 1970s Chile. 1970s Chile was not exactly somewhere you'd want to visit. During this time, there was deep political strife, which escalated in 1973 to a point where the armed forces staged a coup d'etat, overthrowing the civilian government and forming a military dictatorship run by Augusto Pinochet Ugarte. Pinochet had zero regards for fundamental human rights, which was reflected in the way that he treated prisoners of war. Prisoners were kept in completely inhuman conditions and subject to unthinkable forms of state-sponsored torture. Some of the worst methods included electric shocks, physical beatings, sexual abuse, and waterboarding. Some prisoners even reported having their heads submerged in urine and human feces. The state would also engage in a practice called disappearing, which involved pretty much what you might expect. The state would torture a prisoner and then completely wipe them off the map, never to be seen again. To this day, There are hundreds of prisoners who have never been found because of this method. Few even made it out alive in the first place. Number 1. Soviet Gulag. And the number 1 worst place to be a prisoner of war was the Soviet Gulag. The word Gulag is a Russian abbreviation that roughly translates to Chief Administration of Corrective Labor Camps. Essentially, they were prison camps used to house prisoners of war, political criminals, and enemies of the Soviet Union. These were first formed back in 1919, but started to become widely used in the 30s. The Gulag was comprised of hundreds of different camps, which, at their peak, held between 2,000 and 10,000 prisoners each. In fact, it's estimated that by 1936, the Gulag held over 5 million prisoners. And the conditions for these prisoners were simply horrible. For one, Russia gets extremely cold, but prisoners had absolutely zero protection from this harsh climate. They were also forced to work virtually 24 hours a day on construction projects or in mines. And to top it off, there wasn't enough food to go around, disease was rife, and guards would kill anyone who refused to work without so much as a second thought. The number of people who died is estimated to be in the millions, with top figures suggesting that over 1.7 million people died between 1918 and 1956. Based on this number alone, it's easy to see why the Soviet Gulag was probably the worst place to be a prisoner of war in history.